March 5, 1953. Morning frost clings to the concrete at the Słupsk air base in northern Poland. A low ceiling of grey Baltic cloud presses down on the row of sleek silver shapes, their swept wings beaded with moisture. Ground crews shout to each other over the rising whine of jet turbines, the sharp smell of kerosene hanging in the air. In cockpit number 616, Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki tightens his harness and stares through the curved canopy. The MiG-15E around him is the pride of the Soviet bloc, a razor of aluminum and fire that climbs faster and higher than anything the West can build. To his comrades, it is the symbol of socialist progress. To Jarecki, it is a way out. He is only 21, but the last decade has burned years into his eyes. As a boy, he watched Poland crushed first by Nazi boots, then pulled into Moscow's shadow. Now he wears the red star on his wings, serves in a regiment controlled from Soviet headquarters, and flies patrols meant to demonstrate loyalty to Stalin. He says all the right things at party meetings. He laughs at the right jokes. He salutes the right portraits. But under the polished leather helmet, he hides a different map, not the official route he has been briefed on this morning, skirting the northern coast on a training exercise, but a second route memorized in silence, traced again and again in his mind. West across the Baltic, toward a small Danish island called Bornholm, toward freedom or death. There is no third option. The control tower clears him for takeoff. Jarecki closes the canopy with a solid metallic clack. The engine howls as he advances the throttle. The MiG surges forward, the runway rushing beneath him in a blur of white center line and gray slabs. At rotation speed, he pulls gently back on the stick. Feeling the heavy nose rise, the wheels skip once, then leave the concrete. For the first time that day, the young lieutenant breathes. He retracts the landing gear, the thumps of the doors echoing through the fuselage. Officially, he is on a routine border flight. Unofficially, every second is a step closer to treason in the eyes of his superiors. The radio crackles with instructions from the ground, but his replies are clipped, neutral, giving nothing away. Above the shallow, icy coastline, he levels at his assigned altitude and pretends to be just another Soviet-trained pilot on another gray morning. The Baltic Sea opens beneath him, a flat sheet of steel splashed with whitecaps. This is the boundary he has been thinking about for months. Somewhere out there, beyond the haze, is Denmark and the Western Alliance. Behind him, somewhere on the shore, the secret police files already have his name in them. It is only a matter of time before someone asks the wrong question about his family, his comments, his silences. He glances at the simple magnetic compass on the panel, then at his wristwatch. No fancy navigation aids, no radio beacons, just a heading, a time, and the memory of a smuggled map traced under a blanket of darkness. If he turns too early, he risks flying over East German or Soviet-held territory. Too late, and the fuel calculations become a gamble with the cold sea. Jarecki's gloved hand hovers over the radio switch. One click will begin the point of no return. His heart hammers in his chest, drum beats swallowed by the roar of the turbojet behind him. He thinks of friends who disappeared after careless words, of newspapers that print only praise, of a future that looks like an endless parade ground. He thinks of the MiG itself, coveted by Western air forces, and what it might be worth if he can deliver it intact. He flicks the switch. The radio goes silent. In the same motion, he banks gently, then more firmly, bringing the nose around to a new heading, away from the official flight path and toward the invisible island on the horizon. No report to ground control. No acknowledgement of the calls that will start coming in seconds later. Alone in the cockpit, he has just turned a training flight into an international incident. Far below, Polish radar operators begin to frown at their scopes as the bright dot deviates from its corridor. Controllers reach for headsets and microphones, calling his call sign into the static-filled air. He ignores them. At 600 kilometers per hour, every minute counts. The needle on the fuel gauge trembles. The Baltic stretches out, featureless and unforgiving. Ahead, somewhere beyond the murk, sits a modest Danish airfield, a neutral country, and a stunned Western intelligence community that is about to get the surprise of its life. But for now, all that exists for Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki is the cockpit, the instruments, the thin aluminum skin around him, and the narrow line between sky and water that marks his only path to freedom. The radio sits mute on the panel, its red indicator light glowing like an accusation. Somewhere far behind him, voices are shouting his name and call sign into the emptiness. But inside MiG-15 there is only the steady hiss of airflow and the deep animal roar of the engine. Jarecki watches the compass card tremble, locked on the heading he calculated in secret. The Baltic below is a cold, shifting mirror, the grey sky reflected in broken shards. There are no landmarks, no villages, no roads, only the occasional white streak of a ship far beneath him. Each one is a reminder that if the engine quits, the water will be just as merciless as any firing squad. He checks the fuel again. His mind runs through the numbers, the way he did at night in the barracks while his bunkmates snored. Takeoff weight, distance to Bornholm, reserve fuel, margin for error. Razor thin. A small voice whispers that turning back is still possible, that he could roll left, explain the deviation as a navigational mistake, blame the weather, but he knows that someone will dig deeper. Someone will ask why his radio went quiet. In this world, suspicion is often enough to destroy a life. A faint outline appears ahead, barely darker than the horizon. At first he thinks it is a trick of light, a cloud shadow, a smudge on the canopy. Then it solidifies into a low, uneven line. Land. Bornholm. At that same moment, in a cramped Danish radar station on the island, an operator leans toward his scope. A single return has appeared, fast and high, approaching from the east. He checks the schedules. No expected traffic, no NATO training flights, no scheduled civilian airliners on that bearing. He calls for his superior. In the cockpit of the MiG, the island grows quickly, the shape of its coastline resolving into bays and peninsulas. Jarecki lowers his altitude, trading height for certainty, wanting a clearer view of any airfield. He knows only from that smuggled map that Bornholm has one main strip near the town of Rønne. He scans the ground below, eyes flicking between the outside world and his instruments. There, a strip of lighter grey cutting across the green and brown. A runway, with a small cluster of buildings and hangars. No fighters are visible. No flak bursts rise to meet him. Yet, in the Danish control tower, binoculars are raised, faces pressed to glass. The shape on the horizon is not one of theirs. It is smaller than an airliner, more compact, with sharply swept wings and a hungry-looking intake at the nose. Someone mutters a word that has become all too familiar in Western briefings MiG. No one knows what this pilot intends. Is he lost? Is he a Soviet officer making an unannounced visit? Is this the opening move in something much worse? The controller grabs his microphone and transmits on the standard frequencies. English and Danish and hesitant German. Calling the unknown jet. There is no reply. Jarecki can see the runway clearly now. There are cars pulled up near the perimeter, figures standing by the control building. He has no idea what the Danes will do when he lands. Internment, interrogation, perhaps they will send him back, but it is still better than what awaits him if he turns east again. He drops the landing gear. The thud of the mechanism locking into place echoes through the frame. The flaps come down, and the nose rises as the MiG bleeds speed. The jet was built for combat. not polite approaches to foreign airfields, and it resents being slowed. The controls feel heavy, the nose twitchy. On the runway, the Danish ground crew brace themselves, unsure whether to run or stay. The roar grows deafening. The foreign jet slices over the threshold, slightly high and fast. Jarecki eases the stick back, feels the shudder of turbulence over the wings. The main feels hit first, a hard jolt that snaps through his spine. Rubber screams against concrete, and the MiG yaws left. He corrects with a sharp kick of rudder, fighting the tendency of the aircraft to bolt. The airfield rushes past in a blur of hangars and startled faces. He stands on the brakes, feeling the vibrations hammer up through the pedals. For a moment, he thinks the aircraft will overrun the end, plow into the grass and soil. Then, grudgingly, the speed bleeds away. The nose dips. The MiG-15 rolls to a shuddering stop on a Danish runway that was never meant to host the pride of the Soviet fighter force. Inside the cockpit, the sudden silence after throttle idle feels almost unreal. His hands shake as he reaches for the canopy latch. Outside, Danish soldiers and policemen are already running toward the jet, rifles in uncertain hands, their breath steaming in the cold air as they surround the machine that NATO had, until this moment, only seen in distant gun camera footage and blurry photographs. For a moment, no one moves. The MiG squats at the end of the Danish runway, its metal skin ticking as it cools in the chill March air. The red stars on its wings and fuselage are stark against the dull paint, ugly and beautiful at the same time. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki forces himself to breathe slowly. His glove lingers on the throttle at idle. He reaches up, releases the canopy latch, and shoves. The plexiglass bubble slides back with a scrape, and a gust of cold air slaps his face. Hands raised, he stands up in the seat as far as the harness will allow. Danish soldiers skid to a halt a few meters from the aircraft, rifles leveled, eyes wide. None of them has ever been this close to a Soviet front-line fighter. He shouts the first words that come to him. Nie strzelajcie, Polish, I am Polish. Blank stares. He tries again, searching in his memory for schoolboy phrases. Ich bin Pol, kein Russ, I want political asylum. That word, asylum, lands. One of the older officers pushes forward, his greatcoat flapping. He has the stiff posture of someone who remembers the occupation, who has seen uniforms march in uninvited before. In accented German, he calls up to the cockpit. You are defecting. You come alone. Alone. Jarecki answers. Every syllable a confession. I do not return. I want west. There is a beat of silence, the kind that sits on a knife edge. Then the officer gestures with 2 fingers. Climb down. Slowly. Jarecki obeys. Movements exaggerated. Careful. Boots on the wing, then on the ground. Hands still raised. A soldier steps in, pats him down briskly, relieving him of his sidearm and any documents. They find nothing more dramatic than a folded map fragment and a worn photograph from home. It is clear this was no elaborate spy mission. It is simply a young pilot who has had enough. They march him toward the control building. Not roughly, but with the wary firmness reserved for explosives that have not yet gone off. Behind them, mechanics and policemen circle the MiG like villagers around a beached whale, afraid to touch it. Fascinated all the same. Someone stares into the round black intake, half expecting it to growl. In the small briefing room, the air smells of coffee and cigarette smoke. Jarecki sits at a table, his helmet placed before him like an offering. A Danish intelligence officer, his uniform neat but his tie slightly askew, takes a seat opposite. A translator hovers nearby. You crossed from Poland? The officer asks. In this aircraft? Yes, Jarecki says. From Słupsk. I planned this long time. I cannot stay there. My country is not free. The officer scribbles notes, eyes flicking up. Are Soviet pilots involved? Will they come after you, after this aircraft? They will come, Jarecki says quietly. Soon as they know, the reality of that settles over the room. The MiG outside is not just a curiosity. It is a problem, a prize, and a potential powder keg. Denmark is a small nation squeezed between North Atlantic alliance obligations and the constant pressure of the Eastern Bloc. This incident touches both. Within the hour, telephones are ringing from Bornholm to Copenhagen. Coded messages begin to hop across Europe. In distant offices in London and Washington, duty officers read the first reports and then read them again. Slower this time, as if checking for a prank. Polish pilot has landed serviceable MiG-15 on Bornholm. Requests political asylum. Aircraft intact. On the island, guards are posted around the fighter. Floodlights are dragged out and pointed at it as dusk begins to gather, throwing long metallic reflections across the tarmac. No one is allowed closer than a few meters without permission. Cameras appear, their shutters clicking as Danish officers document every angle, every panel line, every marking. From the main runway, other aircraft are grounded or diverted. Bornholm, usually a quiet outpost with modest traffic, has become, in a single morning, the center of the Cold War. Every choice the Danes make now will be watched from both east and west. In his temporary room, under guard yet treated with a cautious courtesy, Jarecki lies on a narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. Exhaustion tugs at his eyelids, but his mind will not rest. He pictures the faces at Słupsk when the news breaks, the questions, the rage. Somewhere, a clock ticks. Each second carries him farther from the world he has fled and deeper into one of uncertain alliances and secretive men who are already circling his stolen jet like hawks. Night settles over Bornholm with a low ceiling and a faint drizzle that beads on steel and glass. On the far side of the airfield, under harsh white floodlights, the MiG shimmers like a creature pulled from the deep. Tarpaulins have been thrown over parts of it, more for secrecy than for protection. Armed guards pace a tight perimeter, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung but ready. In the control building, the atmosphere is thick with cigarette smoke and overlapping accents. Danish officers cluster around a large table, maps and telephones cluttering its surface. A message from Copenhagen lies open, ink still drying. Another sits beside it, freshly decoded from Warsaw, polite on the surface, edged with steel underneath. The Polish government, speaking with a voice everyone understands, comes from Moscow as well, demands the immediate return of both aircraft and pilot. They describe Jarecki as a criminal, a thief, a victim of Western lies. They insist that any delay will be considered an unfriendly act. Denmark is small, but the pressure is enormous. Across the table, a British air attaché leans over the map, his hair still damp from the rain outside. Beside him, an American officer in a rumpled flight jacket taps a pencil against a notepad, eyes burning with a mixture of fatigue and excitement. For years, men in his position have studied grainy photographs of MiG silhouettes over Korea, read combat reports that spoke of tight turns and vicious climb rates. Now, just a few hundred meters away, sits a complete example, engine and guns and all, close enough to touch. We need access as soon as possible, the American says quietly. Every hour counts. If Moscow thinks we have had a good, long look at that machine, they will raise hell. If they suspect we have flown it, they will raise more than that. The Danish commander exhales slowly. There are NATO commitments to consider, but also the hard reality that Denmark lies within reach of Soviet bombers and submarines. You will have limited access, he says, under Danish supervision. No flights, for now. Limited access is still access. Before midnight, A small team is walking out across the tarmac under the watch of Danish guards, their breath steaming in the cold. Tool bags bump against their knees. One carries a camera case, another a notebook already filled with sketches of swept wings and intake geometry. Up close, the MiG-15 is both crude and sophisticated. The rivets are rougher than what Western engineers are used to, the finish less polished, but the lines are purposeful, the structure robust. The American runs a gloved hand along the wing root, feeling the sharp sweep that has proved so deadly in combat. He notes the thickness of the skin, the design of the control surfaces. Every detail is a sentence in a technical report already forming in his mind. They climb the ladder to the cockpit one by one, each pausing to take in the layout. The instruments are simple, functional, with Cyrillic markings and a no-nonsense arrangement. No radar scope, no lavish comforts, just what a pilot needs to fight and survive. The seat, heavy and solid, bears the fittings of an ejection system that has already saved many Soviet-trained airmen. Their philosophy is different. One of the British men murmurs. Rugged, easy to maintain, even with conscript ground crews. Sacrifice a bit of refinement. Get lots of airframes out to the front. Engineers crouch under the fuselage, peering into access panels as Danish mechanics loosen screws under careful instruction. Someone sketches the main landing gear, noting the geometry, the tires, the retraction mechanism. Others examine the gun ports in the nose, the heavy cannons that have torn apart American bombers over Korea. Measurements are taken with tape and calipers. Every number goes into notebooks that will soon be locked in secure pouches, bound for London and Washington. Inside the briefing room, Jarecki faces a different kind of inspection. Allied interrogators sit with him in turn, their questions polite but relentless. They want everything: performance figures, climb rates, stall behavior, how the MiG reacts in a dive, what training Soviet and Polish pilots receive, what radio procedures they use, how often they fly near Western borders. He answers as best he can, drawing diagrams when words fail. He explains how the aircraft feels at high altitude, how it yaws under heavy cannon fire, how the engine responds to throttle changes. He talks about the checklists before takeoff, the way instructors emphasize certain speeds and angles. Each detail is worth its weight in gold. In quiet moments between sessions, when he is left alone with a cup of coffee that has gone cold, he thinks about what he has done to the balance of power that lives in briefing folders and war plans. To him, the MiG was a ticket to escape. To the men now crawling over it with notebooks and flashbulbs, it is something even more dangerous, a window into Soviet design philosophy, a blueprint that might save or cost lives in a future war. Outside, the rain slackens. The floodlights still glare, the shadows of men moving around the jet like ghosts on the wet pavement. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, the Baltic surf hisses against the shore. Out there, beyond the horizon, ships and submarines move under orders drafted in offices with red stars on the wall. They are waiting to see what Denmark will decide, and just how much of their prized fighter the West will be allowed to see. 2 days later, in a secure room in Copenhagen, the walls are lined with fresh photographs. Grainy black and white prints show close-ups of air intakes, undercarriage bays, wing roots, the heavy cannon clustered in the nose of the MiG. Between the images, chalk arrows and quick notes in English and Danish cover a blackboard. An American colonel stands with his hands on his hips, jacket unbuttoned, watching as a technical officer pins up another picture. It shows the cockpit from above, every instrument clear, every Cyrillic marking legible. So that is what our boys in Korea have been fighting, the colonel says quietly. There is no swagger in his voice, only a sober respect. Simple, brutal, built to kill, B-29s. A British engineer with round spectacles steps closer, sliding a ruler along one of the photographs. "Look here," he says. The wing sweep, the thickness at the root. They have copied the best of German wartime research, but they have made it work in quantity. And this compressor design, he taps a blurry image of the engine face. This is no joke either. The room is heavy with the sense of something significant. For years, Western planners have had only second-hand data to work with combat reports from Sabre pilots, fragments of wreckage recovered near front lines, intercepted manuals. Now they have measurements taken by their own people, right down to the gauge of the hydraulic lines and the placement of the gun sight. On the table, beside trays of coffee cups and ashtrays overflowing with butts, lies a neat stack of papers. On the cover page, typed in firm black letters, are the words, "Initial Technical Appraisal of Soviet MiG-15 Fighter Aircraft Origin, Polish Air Force, Defector, Bornholm Incident." Each page distills hours spent on that chilly Danish ramp. Performance estimates, structural analysis, assessments of maintenance needs. The conclusion is concise and sobering. The MiG-15 represents a highly capable and robust short-range interceptor, particularly effective at medium to high altitude. Its rugged construction and straightforward systems permit rapid deployment and high sortie rates. It constitutes a serious threat to Western bomber formations. A messenger collects the first finished copies, seals them in canvas pouches, and carries them to a waiting aircraft. Engines cough to life. Within hours, the dossiers are on their way to London, Paris, Washington, and to the air bases in Germany, where planners continually shuffle counters on maps, imagining the first hours of a war that everyone fears and no one admits they are preparing for. In Washington, deep inside the Pentagon, a different kind of silence falls as the report is read. Around a long table, officers from Air Force intelligence, research and development, and strategic planning lean forward in their chairs. Cigarette smoke curls toward the ceiling as pages turn. The Chief of Air Force Intelligence taps one paragraph with his finger. Confirmation on their guns. 2 heavy calibers and 1 very heavy, all in the nose. No synchronizing gear, no wing flex issues. They can punch like a heavyweight at altitude. Another officer, younger, with pilot wings on his chest, nods grimly. Matches what the Sabre boys have been saying. Short bursts that rip a wing off if they hit. A civilian analyst adjusts his glasses and speaks up. What interests me is not only the aircraft, but the training described by the defector. They are producing many pilots with good basic skills, familiar with jet handling. Combined with this kind of machine, it means we cannot assume qualitative superiority forever. The word defector hangs in the air. For the men in uniform, the MiG is a system, a threat, a puzzle. For the officers in the separate offices of intelligence and psychological warfare, Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki is also a weapon of a different kind. His story will be used to send a message east that even the elite of the Warsaw Pact can choose another path, that loyalty enforced by fear is brittle. Back in Europe, on Bornholm, the storm of diplomacy whips harder. Polish and Soviet representatives arrive with clipped courtesies, their faces set. They demand access to the aircraft, insist that it be prepared for return. The Danes, having quietly allowed Western experts to crawl all over the fighter, must now act the part of the careful neutral once more. Under a cold, flat sky, a small team of mechanics begins to ready the MiG for departure. Panels are screwed back into place, tarps removed. Guards shift their stance, sensing the end of their peculiar duty. The silver machine that had turned their quiet island into a focal point of the Cold War is going home to the very regime its pilot fled. In a guest room not far from the airfield, Jarecki watches a suitcase being closed on his few new possessions. His journey will not end with the MiG. He is being moved under discreet arrangements, away from Bornholm, away from the Baltic that could still carry hostile eyes, towards safer cities and longer interviews. He glances once through the window toward where he knows the runway lies, hidden by low buildings, somewhere beyond those walls. The jet he stole has already begun to change the way distant men think about war. His own life, he knows, is about to be rewritten as well, in languages and uniforms he has only glimpsed in newsreels. On the grey morning when the MiG leaves Bornholm, the island wakes to the sound of a foreign engine one last time. Danish soldiers stand at attention along the perimeter as the silver fighter taxis toward the runway, escorted by local vehicles. The red stars on its wings catch the light, a reminder that the Cold War does not just live on maps and in speeches, but in metal and fuel and decisions made by young men alone in cockpits. At the threshold, the pilot appointed to take the aircraft home pauses for a final check with ground crew. A Danish officer offers a curt nod. With a roar, the MiG begins its takeoff roll, gathering speed, wheels bumping along the concrete that first received it in shock. Then it lifts cleanly into the low sky and turns east, back toward the world it came from. For Bornholm, life will slowly return to normal. The guards leave their posts, the floodlights are taken down, and the airfield goes back to handling the modest traffic of a quiet island. Yet the people who watched that Soviet fighter arrive and depart will carry the memory of its visit and of the thin young pilot who stepped down from the wing with his hands raised into every future conversation about the war that everyone fears and no one dares to start. Franciszek Jarecki is not there to see the MiG go. By then he is already far from the Baltic, moved along a chain of safe houses and secure transports arranged by men who speak in low voices and carry leather folders. There are more interviews in more capitals. Intelligence officers and diplomats ask him the same questions in different ways, testing for cracks that never appear. He tells his story again and again, about Słupsk, about the flight, about the dull, grinding weight of life under a regime that speaks of liberation while locking its people behind borders and slogans. Weeks later, he steps off another aircraft into air that smells different, cleaner, with a hint of spring instead of salt. In a western city whose streets he has only seen in newsreel images, he's met by officials who shake his hand with practiced warmth. Papers are signed, legal phrases are translated for him. The words political asylum become more than just something shouted from a cockpit to armed strangers on a foreign runway. They become his shield. In time, he finds himself once more in a hangar. This one filled with aircraft painted in different colors, with different insignia. A flight instructor in a light jacket walks him around a training jet, explaining systems in slow, careful English. The cockpit smells of new plastic and machine oil. When he settles into the seat and closes his fingers around the stick, it feels both familiar and alien. The language on the dials has changed. The idea of who he is flying for has changed even more. Reporters eventually find him. There are photographs, stiffly posed, of the young defector in a borrowed suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes still carrying the intensity of a man who has rolled the dice on his own life. Articles are printed that turn his flight into a symbol, a story to be read in Polish villages by secret candlelight and in Western cafes over coffee. Yet when the noise dies down, what remains for Jarecki are quieter things. Letters from family, filtered through distant channels. The ache of knowing that, in choosing one sky, he has cut himself off from another. Long evenings where he sits alone, hearing the echo of an engine and feeling the weight of a harness that is no longer there. Far away, in Soviet and Polish staff meetings. His name is spoken with anger. His act labeled as treachery. His aircraft studied for signs of what might have been learned while it sat under Danish floodlights. Procedures are changed. Briefings gain new warnings about border flights and the danger of pilots who think too much. The system tightens, but it cannot erase the fact that one of its own used the sharpest weapon it owned to carve a hole in the curtain that separates east from west. On maps spread across Western planning tables, Small annotations appear next to the silhouettes of MiG fighters. Numbers are adjusted, estimates refined. The shadow of those swept wings over Korea now has weight and dimension. Decisions about bomber routes, escort tactics, and future designs are made with a new clarity that did not exist before a Polish lieutenant pointed his nose toward Bornholm. In the end, the story of that morning becomes part of the larger fabric of the Cold War, one thread among many. But if you were standing on that Danish runway on that March day, feeling the ground tremble as a machine from the other side of the Iron Curtain slid to a halt in front of you, it would have felt larger than history. It would have felt like watching the line between worlds flicker, just for a moment, in the roar of a single jet and the steady steps of a young pilot walking toward an uncertain future.